Hey. All right, you guys can go ahead and begin.
Okay. Well, why don't you guys go? I'm trying to get a place.
Cool. I'm happy to go first.
Talk to
Cool. So not a ton of work this week because of the holidays and stuff, but one kind of there's two things I guess really I've been working on. One with Danny and I've been doing a bit of work of kind of testing stuff. So kind of finishing up the state language so we can specify different protocol states for pretty much any protocol. Mm-hmm. And that kind of lets us test them as well, which is fun. So work there. And then the other thing I worked on this week was kind of getting a first version of the, Vlad calls it the concurrent schedule replication, which is pretty much, only ordering blocks if we need to order blocks. It's pretty much, think of a regular blockchain, but we don't have to order everything. And have kind of a first version for that going. It's, it's a real work in progress, but hopefully we'll get somewhere pretty interesting over the next week or so. So that's it for me. And I don't know.
That's really interesting. The concurrent schedule replication thing. Like I saw you had posted the GIF in the Discord, and do you have any more that you could elaborate on that? Like where you're at with it?
Yeah, sure. So here's kind of where it's at as of now. So the fork choice for the, as you can imagine, for this is a little bit more complicated. I guess it's much more complicated than the blockchain because, resolving conflicts kind of in a greedy way can get kind of complicated in certain cases and get a little bit confusing and hard to reason about. So to deal with this, I just said simple first version, I'll have a concurrent rewrite for the first round, and then kind of just a blockchain forever after. That's just kind of a result of the fact that all the inputs are consumed initially, and there's not. Sorry, I'm using a little bit too much lingo. So, anyways, I guess what I'm saying is as of now, it's we essentially have a single round of a concurrent rewrite going on where we could have at most 3 blocks or however number of validators rewriting the thing in parallel or concurrently, and kind of have all of those blocks be valid and be able to build on all at once. But kind of after that, it stops because all of the inputs that can be consumed get consumed. And so kind of what needs to change is I need to make them generate new inputs afterwards. But as a result of that complicates the fork choice a bit, which is why I pushed it off to version number 2.
Right. But, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Probably the best way of thinking about this thing and the way that Vlad described it that kind of helped me wrap my head around it the most is probably in a UTXO model for Bitcoin. If you think about, the general idea is that we have inputs being consumed and outputs being generated, and 2 blocks conflict if they consume the same inputs. Probably the easiest way to think about that is in the context of UTXOs. But it also, to some degree makes sense in a account model, etc. But anyways.
Yeah, sweet. Are you guys going to write up the fork choice rule and have it available somewhere at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping to get up a PR and also add to the wiki by the end of the week. So I'll keep you updated.
Sweet.
Cool.
I guess I'll go next. So I was working last week on sort of going through the data that I had from my simulation that was using political capital. And I was looking specifically at a strategy where under some threshold, the validators trying to earn political capital and above that threshold, they would try to make a block with basically as many contracts as were around that could be sort of shoved into that block. And they would spend all of their political capital to do it. So then they'd go back down to to zero, and then they'd start earning political capital again. So I was calling this the threshold spender strategy. And so what I was finding in the simulation is that the higher the threshold was, the better the validator would perform. And that kind of makes sense because essentially they would just accumulate a whole bunch of political capital and then at the end just dump it all into one block that earns a crazy amount of rev by eating up all of the available contracts. But of course, it's not really what we want, because it means that it's naturally encouraging everyone to sit around and do nothing for a long time, and then eventually sort of dumping everything all at once on the blockchain.
Sorry, when you say better, the better the validator does that mean, the more revenue they earn?
Yes, that's the metric that I've been using.
Cool.
So I was trying to figure out sort of how to deal with that. The other issue was that because there was sort of a clear cut, this strategy is better than that strategy, you tended to get a group of strategies that were all very similar. And so when you have everyone having similar spending thresholds, you end up with lots and lots of branching happening, and then sort of randomly one branch getting selected, which means you have really long branches that ultimately don't accomplish anything. And maybe a visual will help here. Let's see if I've got it here. I did start putting together like a little research journal for myself to keep track of things that I was learning. And maybe I'll screen share this. So, sorry, just a sec. So this is an animation like I've shown before of this consensus happening with a whole bunch of validators that all have similar thresholds, and the thresholds are relatively long. So you can see at the beginning there's that just mess of red is where everyone is trying to build up political capital.
Can anyone else see it? I don't know if I'm the only one, but I can't.
Oh, you can't? Okay, sorry.
That's on a notepad.
Yeah, I see the notepad. Yeah, that's...
okay, hold on. Sorry. Let me do this. Does that make it better?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Right, sorry. So you can see the mess of red at the beginning is everyone just trying to build up their political capital. And then after that happens is when you get all of the branches going off in different directions. And you can see the red line sort of jumping back and forth between the two long branches. And then eventually one is selected. And that just keeps happening over and over again. So you end up with these sort of long dead branches that aren't doing anything, which is also not really ideal.
And this is coming from like running this evolutionary algorithm that tries to maximize revenue?
Yes, that's correct.
Maybe to harp on Vlad's point for a bit, but does it make sense maybe to remove the concept of political capital from the core consensus protocol and kind of say, we'll specify a strategy for validators to actually build a blockchain later, but that's maybe a Leibniz consideration, and kind of give yourself more flexibility there. I don't know, just to repeat Vlad's talking points.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's a fair question. I don't necessarily want to give up on it just yet. But yeah, all that may in the end ultimately be the conclusion is that having political capital sort of ingrained in the protocol itself either makes the protocol inefficient or too complicated, because you end up having to insert a whole bunch of extra conditions to sort of make it more efficient. But for now, what I thought about trying was changing the fork choice rule. And this is mostly what I wanted to talk about with you guys, just to make sure that I wasn't going to go down some totally unproductive rabbit hole. where basically, since we have this notion of political capital, we have a notion of how much a block is worth to the person that created it, because they attach their political capital to their block. And so I was wondering if we just adopt the proof of work fork choice rule, but instead of work, we use political capital. So basically, you always pick the fork that has the most political capital in its chain, which is a very simple fork choice rule and sort of really leverages this political capital idea, and builds on things that are presently working. So I was wondering if anyone was aware of this already being tried before, or if anyone sees any obvious flaws that this could have.
Okay, interesting. This is a really interesting question. Okay, so my first question is there a limited amount of political capital that's known at every point in time? Like, well, do I know how much political capital there's going to be maximum at 10 years in the future?
Yes, you do.
Okay. Interesting.
Well, so I'm going to say yes with an asterisk. Actually, not necessarily just strictly speaking yes. You can definitely give yourself an upper bound. Maybe not 10 years in the future. That's pretty far. But the amount of political capital is not a concern. It's not a fixed quantity in a particular way. Political capital can sort of come and go over time, depending on the consensus algorithm. Because essentially what happens is when someone spends political capital, it's gone. They can never get that back. And when others basically vote for that block saying, yes, I want this block in my blockchain, they earn a fraction of that political capital back for themselves. So what ends up happening?
But the total supply of political capital is fixed. I mean, you can keep it fixed, right? At least for that population of validators. That's what he's asking. Is it fixed like the supply of Bitcoin is fixed?
No, it's not.
It is, right? Or at least that's the way I designed the protocol. The total supply of political capital is fixed.
It's fixed for a fixed number of validators. That's
correct. For a population of validators, it's fixed. Yeah.
But if new validators come on the scene, then new political capital appears or can appear. So saying, will I know how much there is 10 years down the line? Maybe. It depends on whether or not you also know how many people you expect to join the network in the next 10 years.
For the Genesis block, it's fixed.
For the Genesis block.
Okay. I think I get you. So you can kind of, to some degree, think of it like total weight or something. For validators, it's like, fixed unless new people join or, someone screws up or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So one thing that you'll have to consider in your fork choice is that the total difficulty now makes a synchrony assumption, and unless you have a special case for when validators join, right? So you can't just do total weight. You're going to have like a switching over period, whatever that means, and that someone's weight can only contribute to the stuff that occurs above when they join, if that makes sense. So the issue is you can't have a validator join and then their weight contribute to the safety or the fork choice of past blocks, because then you can never make a decision with any certainty, right? If you have this.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, that's obvious. I mean, like if they join, they don't get to influence the past for joining.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that is already kind of built into the protocol, not necessarily in the fork choice rule, but in the restrictions around sort of what you're allowed to do. So, for example, you're not allowed to acknowledge a block that you're only allowed to acknowledge blocks that are the most recent message from that sender, which sort of in itself prevents you from influencing the past.
So not necessarily. So imagine I'm a node that's offline, right? And I have this like max political capital fork choice rule, and a bunch of new validators join, and let's say they're all really great, and I don't know, what determines how much political capital they get, but
everyone starts at 0 when they join, so they have to acknowledge to earn political capital from the start.
Okay, interesting. So let's say they earn some political capital, and they increase the total amount of political capital in the system, which I guess we said was possible. If I come online now and I look at the, state of the blocks of my view or whatever, and I see that the highest weight chain is now the one that includes their blocks on it, and I say that because of the messages that they've made, then, we're not asynchronously safe anymore. So essentially, I think, anyone say that? Just me.
Well, I have to edit that.
Anyways, sorry, I'll continue. Yeah. So essentially you have to say like the weight of new validators stops where their first block is included. It's not enough to just say only consider the latest message from someone. We also have to say their weight in the fork choice stops at the block that they joined at, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. That's that is a good point. Yeah, that's totally a good point.
Okay, second question I have for you. It seems like this might make reasoning about what to do in the case of equivocation, etc., harder. I mean, sorry, I should definitely know this, but I'm not an expert on R-chain proof of stake. Political capital is distinct from the deposit that you put down when you bond. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah, the political capital is at least the original way I conceptualized it was it's proportional to stake, but it's separate from stake.
Interesting.
Yeah, that because I was looking at it from a psychological point of view. I don't think people would be happy if their stake is sloshing around inside the network. You can probably prove that it's safe, but I don't. Even if you had a solid mathematical proof, I don't think that people would be happy with their stake sloshing around. So you just build so you just have a separate tokenized representation of that's sloshing around.
Yeah. So the way I have it set up right now is the political capital is essentially, it's not worth any money. It can't be traded for any other type of token. It is a part of the consensus and nothing else. So it's not really worth anything in that sense.
It's worth something probably because you can use it to get your blocks in faster or something like that, right?
Right, but so you basically, there's an indirect way that you could do that. Like you could pay a validator to act a particular way, but intrinsically it's not it's not worth anything, and its only purpose is to say how much you want a block to be in the blockchain. Like you create a block, you attach some political capital to it, and the more you attach, the more likely it is to be a part of the main blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Well, I guess the point I was going to make is it seems like it might make reasoning about what to do in the case of equivocation or nodes going offline, etc., a bit more complicated because now we have this weight that we're going to slash separated from the fork choice, but I'm assuming we'd also slash political capital in that case, and things might get kind of weird.
I think slashing should always be economic, right? You should always slash someone for rev, and
right. But we also want a Byzantine nodes to not. We'd prefer that a Byzantine node doesn't contribute to the fork choice. I think. If you're equivocating all over the place, it'd probably be preferable if you weren't contributing to the fork choice as well, right?
Yeah, the main idea there is that they can't keep equivocating all over the place and remain standing. If their stake goes to zero, they can't play in the protocol.
Interesting. So their political capital would drop to zero anyways, I guess.
Well, effectively, it drops to zero, right?
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, if you spend a whole bunch of political capital to make an equivocation style block, and someone notices, then your political capital went to zero when you made the block because you spent so much on it. And then now you're also getting slashed economically because someone noticed your equivocation. So now you've got no political capital and no revenue. So it was just overall a bad move. Or at least that's how we would hope it would play out.
Okay. Cool. I guess I'm gonna attempt to read up on Archain over the next like couple days, so I can maybe give some better feedback. But I guess my initial reaction and like what I think Vlad's initial reaction might be is that I'm worried you might lose the safety proof if you make this change at the fork choice, because the estimator to some degree has to have some pretty specific properties for the like safety proof to hold, and I'm not totally sure that this satisfies everything.
What's the condition that you consider being violated here?
I guess my main worry is that like there's this property of lock-in. I don't know a great way of saying it, but like kind of like, if greater than 50% of people have seen that, greater than 50% of people have seen it, then it's kind of locked in forever, with some level of fault tolerance. You know what I mean?
I think that's
like an example estimator that would never work would be something like pick a random blockchain, right?
Yeah, sure. Understood. Yeah, no. I think that the important point about this is that this is factorable. That it doesn't, that was kind of the way I designed it, is that part of the proof is minimally, if at all, impacted by the introduction of the political capital.
Yeah, that was my impression as well. Like from what I remember about the abstract CBC paper was that the conditions were basically just that the estimator had to be consistent with respect to your logic, so it couldn't you couldn't have your estimator be giving you contradictions. And in this context, it's always what is in the blockchain is basically your logic. Like, is this in the blockchain or not? And the estimator of the one with the most political capital is in the blockchain should never give any contradiction. So I didn't think it would break any of the safety stuff, but it's possible that it does.
Okay, yeah, I guess it's you should definitely bring it up with Vlad, and I look forward to like looking into the Archain stuff over the next couple of days and getting a better understanding. But it sounds interesting.
Cool. Michael, thank you for that update. I thought that was really cool. I actually was happy to hear that we're making forward progress even during Christmas week. So this is awesome. I have some updates which are kind of fun. So if people are ready, I can give sorry about the noise from before. I was just trying to be able to screen share. And I switched machines. Let me see if I can now find the Zoom. Where's Zoom there? There it is. Okay, cool. Was that it for those two updates?
Yep, I'm done.
Yep, okay. I'm here.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I've been working on interpreting a particular flavor of string diagram that is associated with process theories that have a particular kind of construction for the trace. And so again, the larger context for this work is my hypothesis that a partially traced monoidal category axiomatizes the notion of consensus, which allows us to effectively bring all of the different flavors of consensus that we get from Casper CBC, the finality gadget, and other things kind of under one axiomatization. And it helps. And with that, then we can kind of do integration. Like we can imagine a network that was half Casper CBC, one flavor of Casper CBC, and then 1/4 a finality gadget, and 1/4 proof of work, right? So that would be, and then we could reason about the end-to-end consensus over the entire network. That's one of the applications of this approach, and why it's kind of interesting. Because even if we just had one consensus algorithm to begin with, over time, we would want to maintain or modify the consensus algorithm. And so you might have it rolled out to some portion of the nodes in the network. So again, if you just add the dynamics of software development to a network that starts off consistent and coherent, then over time it begins to be a network that has different consensus algorithms running, because the updates don't necessarily all roll out at the same time, or you might get various kinds of forking behavior within the network. So being able to reason end to end about the composition of different consensus algorithms is important. And that's why I want to look at an axiomatization of the consensus itself that would allow us to think about the composition of these different networks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I haven't reached your level of abstraction yet, I think. So I'm still wrapping my head around it, but it sounds really interesting. So I get it.
Just from a software engineering point of view, you can't assume that over time all nodes in the network are going to be running the same consensus algorithm. And so now you have a problem, right? Or you could say it this way: it's not always going to be the same. There's not always going to be one network. So whether you think about that network as composed of nodes that have kind of diverged over time, or nodes the two networks or in networks that started off with slightly different or even wildly different consensus algorithms over time, one still wants to be able to reason about the consensus end to end. I mean, this is already happening with building bridges, the kind of exchange networks that are building out the bridge from Bitcoin to Ethereum or that kind of thing, right? And so we'd like to be able to say, well, if proof of work interacts with proof of stake in particularly disciplined ways, then consensus is still good, right? And if you couldn't say that, then you wouldn't ever want to enter into an exchange across the networks. So I think most people believe that it's possible to bridge between the two networks without getting royally screwed. And so that's why there are various exchanges built up. But if you had an axiomatization of the consensus, then you could talk about potentially composing the two consensus algorithms, because both of them satisfy the axioms, and then they satisfy the axioms in particular ways, and so then you can look at compositions. That's the basic idea at a high. And so, my hypothesis is that partially traced monoidal categories are going to provide this axiomatization where traced composition is the notion of consensus that's being applied when two nodes are communicating or in nodes are communicating. So that's again the high level view. And so what I've been looking at is these particular string diagrams where I can express the trace in terms of some building blocks called cup and cap. And that's been very challenging because there seemed to be a weird relationship between time and causality. So it looks at it under certain interpretations, it looks like time can flow backwards with respect to causality. Or you can, it's like you can have time reach backwards, and if you can have certain communication events reach backwards in time and undo things, which is a little bit weird, but it's not weird if you consider transactional interpretations of these kinds of things, where certain actions are effectively rollbacks of conditions that have been established within the network. So that actually is very promising. And so what I realized was I could get, and effectively what I'm doing is I'm building an interpretation of the diagrams in the row calculus to make it really, really concrete and really simple. And, the other way of thinking about this work is that it builds off of the algebraic chainometry work that I presented a few weeks ago. So the idea is actually comes from some work that I did on knots, interpreting knots as processes. And the basic idea is that we turn a channel into a 4-part critter. So we can easily talk here. Let me take one of these and just do a group, and then I can rotate this puppy. So it might be a little bit more. Here we go. Okay, so let's say that we have, a character over here and a character over here, and they want to talk to each other. Well, and let's say that every character comes with its own wire. Okay, so let's say that Alice is over here, and Alice has a wire, and Bob is over here, and Bob has a wire. So with a particular discipline, they can make sure that their messages don't ever get garbled or mixed up on the same wire. So Alice always speaks to Bob on her wire, and Bob always listens to Alice on Alice's wire. And Bob always speaks to Alice on Bob's wire, and Alice always listens to Bob on Bob's wire. So that's called a twisted pair, and it's obviously just like various kinds of cabling, physical cabling that are used at the phi layer of the internet. So this is a twisted pair kind of construction. It's also in the OCAPS literature. You can think of this as kind of polarized channels, right? So from Alice's point of view, she only speaks on her channel, and she only listens on Bob's channel. So her discipline on the use of these channels is unidirectional. She never listens on the Alice channel. She only listens on the Bob channel. So her use her use of channels enjoys a polarity, and likewise for Bob. So we can think of channels as effectively polarized in that way. But you can also think of this. I'll get to the knot interpretation in just a minute. So if we have if we have polarity, that gives you a certain kind of dimension to the channel, which is only twofold, right? So every channel has effectively two ends. And if you want channels to have, to be able to deal with this funny information flow, causality, or transactional interpretation of these string diagrams, then you actually need information to flow in one more dimension. So you can think of it this way. Input could flow here and then pop out here, but it takes a certain amount of time to do that. And so that's one way of thinking about it. Or it could be that we observed the input here, and so we did so the output here, and so we deduce the input here. In other words, time flows backwards in one of these, and time flows forwards in the other one, right? So really, the input happened here, but it comes out here. So if this is the time dimension, then this is both of these points are forward in time, right? But in one case, we were running time backwards. So you can kind of think of this as information flow dimension, and this is time dimension. And so every channel then essentially has 4 parts. And what that gives you is the ability to interpret things, to interpret certain operations that are commonly associated with quantum mechanics or certain flavors of linear algebra. So, but it's really easy to understand geometrically. So the geometric interpretation is that I have some symmetries that I can observe. I can flip channels up for down, right? So I could take these channels here and put them down here, and these channels here and put them up here. So it's like I flipped the diagram about a line going across the center here. Or I can flip left for right, and that's as if I'm flipping the channels across a line going down like this. So let me just stop there and make sure that at least the naive intuitions make sense, regardless of whether or not you can see how they connect to consensus. Does that make sense?
So what do the symmetries have? Like, what do they mean, the fact that these symmetries exist? Because you were talking about time is going forward sort of along your x-axis. So doing that symmetry where you swap left for right is sort of like saying you're swapping your forward in time for your backward in time, which feels like a weird thing to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're and it's not weird if you think about transactions. What you're saying is like within a sort of transactional boundary, certain observations forced certain events and certain rollbacks. So you're saying that basically you're giving time symmetry just like there is in physics.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And when you flip up for down, you're basically flipping who's talking and who's listening.
Cool. Yep.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
That's yeah. And so what that allows us to do is to interpret the 3 operations of, adjoint and transpose and conjugacy, just like in ordinary linear algebra and quantum mechanics. So we can now interpret all of those operations in terms of the various symmetries on the use of the channels. And that makes life work out rather nicely. But it also allows us to introduce cup and cap. And with cup and cap, we can construct a trace, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. But notice that instead of connecting output to input, right, or input to output, we connect output to output and input to input, and that gives a kind of funny. So you could think of these as relational constraints, right? And in fact, there is a relational model of these diagrams. So it's not It's not a completely wacko thing physically. It's just, it's like you've got a team of critters that are making sure that what you observe here is what you observe here, and what you observe here is what you observe here. That's one way to think about cup and cap.
So should I think about it as like the identity channel? This is the channel that takes, sort of just like preserves my signal?
It's a little bit funny when you're talking about output. It's not right. So output to output it's more like a constraint. It's more like I'm going to output this if you output that same value, which is again starting to look like consensus and smell like consensus.
Okay.
Right. So that's the kind of relational constraint that's happening here. And input to input, I'm willing to accept this value if you also accept this value. And you have to accept this value if I accept this value. Right. So again, it's not quite identity. It's more like a relational constraint.
Cool. Yep, that makes sense.
Cool. And so now the next part of the puzzle is constructing things with cup and cap that to prove that the identities hold. So in the normal string diagram language, there's certain diagrams that are the same, and this was what was driving me nuts for quite some time. Like a couple of days before I started to notice something. So I'm going to get rid of, let me get another one of these. And then, oops. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna line these up this way, but they should line up at the corners. It's just because I didn't put the dots right at the corner. But there are some laws called the yanking laws. And they run like this. Get this out of the way. And now over here, I can wire them up the other way. So if we talk about composing them in time, I do cup and then I do cap. And running this way, I should be able to do, oops. I do cap and then I do cup. That's the idea. And then both of these, so now we can talk about an identity channel. And that identity channel is it can effectively be this one, right? So rather than doing any processing, if I receive a signal here, then I output the signal over here. Vice versa, if I outputted at this point, then I, backwards in time, then I inputted that, from before or from after. So it's a kind of weird constraint like thing. But it's identity in the sense that the information is a pass through. That's the basic idea. And now the issue is that this diagram needs to equal this diagram. And this diagram needs to equal this diagram from the point of view that if I have constraints on the outputs and the corresponding constraints on the inputs, then it's just a pass through, right? Equality here, it's got to be a pass through, right? What I inputted, I outputted, although it flows backwards in time here. And likewise over here, what I inputted, I outputted. And this is sort of this is the way we normally think about identity. Now, this path corresponds to that path. And this path corresponds to this path. So we're missing half the paths in either one. But it turns out when you start gluing these together, you only ever get to, except with the cat, you only ever get to wire them up, to follow one of the paths. You don't get to wire them up to follow both the forward direction in time and the backwards direction in time at the same time. You never get both of those options. There's always a selection on one of those options. And in fact, so I was realizing that these diagrams were effectively true, even though they weren't on the nose true. These identities were effectively true when I hit exactly the same issue in Kuka and Kissinger's interpretations of quantum mechanics for the string diagrams. So what they have to do in order to get the notion of equality here is to explicitly introduce the direction in these things, in these diagrams. So these lines are directed now, and this is directed, and this is directed. And now their identities are exactly the identities we have here. That this one corresponds to this path, this directed path. Did I get that right? No, sorry. Corresponds to this directed path. And this one corresponds to this directed path. So when they go to give an operational interpretation that has, physical reality and a relationship between causality and time, they also have to give this directed interpretation of the diagrams and the corresponding identities. And so we respect exact that when we do this. And so that's how this is. So that gives me a lot of confidence that I'm on the right track when I do this particular kind of interpretation of their diagrams. I know I've been yammering on, so I'll just bring this to a close. But so just how this is related to the trace. Well, suppose I have one of these. And I have some arbitrary thing that's not necessarily a channel, but it's a process that has some channels associated with it. I'll just grab this one for fun. And then I have one of these. Oops. So now I only have to have a wire that runs from here to here. So this is under the assumption that these things are closed up. So let me just move these a little bit closer. Right, so they're connected at this channel, and they're connected at this channel. And now we have our trace. That's how you build the trace with the cup and the cap. And those cups and caps, if you recall, are exactly this forcing of agreement. We agree on inputs. We agree on outputs. And so when we put the trace involved, that what it's doing is it's forcing agreements on inputs and outputs. And so then if you look at the traced composition of the GOI, that's the geometry of interaction, what the trace is doing is insisting that at the point where two processes are communicating, they must agree on all the common state. And so that's the basic intuition for how we think of the trace as giving or axiomatizing the consensus. It's telling us precisely where the points of agreement are in a composed process, right? So if I have if I have a bunch of nodes and a bunch of clients, then they're looking at different chunks of state where they have to agree. And the trace is telling you exactly where they agree and how they go around the loop in order to agree, and not just at any one communication point, but across the entire network. So I'll stop there and kind of get any feedback. Sorry to yammer on, but I thought the diagrams were kind of fun.
Yeah, so I think that's cool. I didn't totally follow the last part about constructing the trace. So
yeah,
so you had some arbitrary process. So it has inputs and outputs on it.
Yeah.
And you're trying to basically say that the inputs and outputs are constrained to agree, but then when it was connected to itself, it seemed like it was only constrained to agree to itself, which I didn't.
Right. So there are different ways you can use the trace. So you can use so here's I'm going to give the shorthand form of the trace to explain that. So you could use trace to implement recursion. So think of it this way. An input comes in, and if it passes a certain condition, it goes straight out. If it doesn't pass a certain condition, then we need to do some processing. So the list comes in. If it's sorted, it goes straight back out. If it's not sorted, we go and do a certain process. And then we need to check to see if it's sorted. So we do our process, then we shunt it out here, and it comes back in here. And now we check and see, is it sorted? If it's sorted, we send it out.
Okay, I see.
Not sorted,
that
we back around. Yeah. So basically, trace, and this is a part of the literature going back to the late 80s, early 90s. Traces are our way to implement certain kind of tamed recursions. And so once you understand this idea, then let's say we have two processes. So let me go grab a process. I guess I'll take this one. Oops.
Could you bring the screen share back if you're manipulating your diagrams again?
Yeah, sure. 1 second. Just gotta go grab Zoom. Okay, so here's the idea. Right, we have a list come in. If it's sorted, we come straight out. If it's not sorted, we shunt it out. We do some processing. We shunt it out the door. We come back in the door. We check to see if it's sorted. If it is, we go out. If it isn't, we go do some processing, shunt it out the door, come back in and check. So that's trace as recursion. So now let's do, let's imagine that we've got a couple of different processes, right? And I'm going to get rid of these.
Hey, Greg, I gotta leave in like 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll be done in 1 minute.
No problem.
Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so essentially, now the two processes are talking to each other. And in order to talk to each other, what we'll do is, if an input comes in here or here, we want to, we want to check to see if there's any state that's associated that these two need to agree on. If they don't have to agree, in other words, this is working in a namespace that this one never touches, then we can just do our processing and shunt it out the door. If they have to agree, then what we do is we wire this puppy up to, we shunt it out the door here, and we bring it in the door here. And now we do the symmetric version of that to handle the other side. So there's the symmetric version. If stuff comes in here and there's no namespace overlap, it goes out the door. If stuff comes in here and there is a namespace overlap, then we shunt it out the door here and it comes here. And now what happens with respect to the trace as consensus is, do we agree? Okay, we can go. Do we not yet agree? Okay, then we have to go back around and check over here. Do we agree? And what they do is they go around this traced composition, just like this iteration over here. We go around this traced composition until they are in agreement. And so you can think about this in terms of the Casper message flow, as this is the validators sending messages to each other until they have finalization of some kind or some confidence. And this is where the partial nature of the trace comes in. FLP also contributes to the partiality of the trace. So until there's some finalization with respect to the state where they had to have agreement in order to make the computation. So that's the way the trace corresponds to the consensus in this larger picture. And with that, I'll shut up.
So, Greg, there is one thing I wanted to bring up to your attention. It doesn't have to be today, but if we can set up maybe a quick 5-minute call when you get back from Hawaii, that would be ideal.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Cool.
We're back on the 30th. So.
Cool stuff, Greg.
Awesome.
Cool, great talking to you guys.
Yeah, likewise. I just wanted to mention before I jump off that I'll be going over this material in a little bit more detail on the 29th. So I'm just going to give a special session to talk about this material in more detail and how it relates to knots and quantum mechanics and other kinds of diagrams. So for people, and I think I'll probably do it at about the same time. So about, no, maybe an hour later. Yeah. So an hour and a half later. So 8:30 on the 29th, which will be 6:30 my time. I'll go over this. So that's Pacific Standard Time, 8:30 in the morning on the 29th, or 6:30 in the morning on the 29th.
Will it be in this room, or can you post a link in the?
I'm gonna do it in my usual Zoom room. I'll post a link somewhere.
Awesome. Thanks.
If you want to if you want that recorded, Greg, let me know. Try to just shoot me a text, and I'll try to jump on.
Oh, okay. I mean, if you're available, then we can use this sim room.
Okay, yeah, just shoot me a text with a reminder, and then so I can make 29th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific.
It would be 8:30 a.m. Pacific.
Yeah, 8:30 a.m. Pacific. Okay, yeah, I'll try to write that down.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem. Alrighty.
All right. Ciao, guys.
Later
All right,
on.
thanks, guys.
See you guys.